Look at the political year ahead and hopefully tell us what to watch out for. Bruce Hawker from Campaigns and Communications joins us from Queensland today, where there's probably going to be an election campaign underway sooner rather than later. And also with me here in Canberra this afternoon, David Speers, former Liberal advisor, now with ECG, a director of ECG Advisory Solutions. Welcome to you both. I want to start on the issue of poker machines. Bruce, what's going on here? Julia Gillard goes down to meet Andrew Wilkie last night for a couple of hours. They both come out saying the talks were constructive. What's the point of the talks? The whole deal was done between these two. What's going on here, do you think?
Well, my guess, and I don't know for sure, David, is that they're starting to discuss some of the detail. The fact that Wilkie continues to refer to those discussions as constructive, I think, is probably a positive sign. Nick Xenophon's come out and warned all sorts of dire things, but I think he's struggling a bit for relevance these days. There's no doubt, though, that the pokies legislation is going to be very controversial if it goes through in the form that Wilkie wants. And there's going to be a lot of MPs, particularly in New South Wales and Queensland, who'll be concerned about this mandatory pre-commitment. So we'll just have to wait and see. But it seems to me that since Peter Slipper's taken over the speakership, that there has been a little bit more movement by Wilkie on the issue, and hopefully that'll mean that we'll get a decision which everybody can live with.
Well, that's the point, isn't it? The defection of Peter Slipper has taken the pressure off Julia Gillard and Labor a little bit, and it means there is perhaps more room to move there. They can go with a plan that is a little bit more watered down in its impact. Do you think that's what's going on here, that she's putting that to Andrew Wilkie, something that's perhaps not as strong as he originally wanted?
That's my guess, but it's only a guess. I don't know for sure, and we'll just have to wait and see. And clearly, I think Wilkie is starting to lower the expectations on his part. I mean, at one stage it was all about, if we don't get the package I'm after, I'm walking. We're not hearing that sort of language now. So perhaps his earlier position is something which he's prepared to move away from somewhat in order to get some outcome which suits him as far as mandatory commitments goes, or something on those orders, that line.
And Bruce, you know how dangerous this issue is for Labor MPs in Western Sydney, and they're in Queensland too. What is at stake for them if the current model were to go through? Would we really be seeing a lot of MPs lose their seats?
Well, what we would see is a very significant campaign from Clubs Australia in New South Wales, Queensland, and to some extent, I think, Victoria as well. And that's something that the Labor members, particularly in marginal seats in Western Sydney and in regional areas, can do without. I think both Tony Windsor and Rob Oakeshott have expressed some concerns about the legislation as it's currently being formulated by Wilkie. So I think all in all there's a view that perhaps this was a sledgehammer being used to crack a walnut, and perhaps they now need to withdraw a bit from that more extreme position of mandatory pre-commitment.
David, what do you think about this issue? If Julia Gillard does manage to come up with something that's a bit more watered down, whether it's $1 bet limits or whether it's delaying the introduction of this or only applying it to fewer clubs than all of them, is this still going to be a hot potato?
Look, the thing that shifted on this, as Bruce alluded to, was the election of Peter Slipper to the speakership. And as soon as that happened, don't worry about Nick Xenophon, it was Andrew Wilkie who became irrelevant to the deal that was struck to form the government, and as soon as that was done, it gave Julia Gillard the wriggle room she needed to get out of jail on a deal that was going to have significant adverse effects for so many New South Wales and Queensland MPs.
Do you think, like Nick Xenophon's suggestion here is that what Labor will do is put something up it knows is going to be rejected in Parliament by people like Tony Windsor and Rob Oakeshott, therefore be defeated? Andrew Wilkie might make good on his promise and walk away from the government, but it's not going to bring down the government anymore. Do you think that's what's going on here? Do you think Labor will put up something it knows will fail? Yeah,
I think that's entirely possible. Some sort of watered-down agreement that is going to meet the satisfaction of the clubs and of the marginal seat holders. That'll be her most, important decision-making vehicle here, are the marginal seat holders. And so you've got someone who's made a deal that is prepared to walk away from it, which will, I suspect, add to sort of some of that kind of reservation that exists in the body politic and with the voting population generally.
Let's look more broadly at the year ahead. Bruce, Labor's 2011 was average, to put it kindly. What does Labor need to do in 2012, and what can it best hope for, do you think, as it looks to the year ahead?
Well, I think the big challenges in 2012 are going to be, one, to make sure that the carbon tax is implemented in a way that takes a lot of the anxiety out of the electorate. That means making sure that the compensation fund starts flowing from, I think, July, whenever it is, into people's pockets, and they realise that the sky doesn't fall in as a result of this legislation. That's number one. Number two, I think, is to really start bringing the heat onto Tony Abbott and his prescriptions for the coming year and for the next election. And central to that, ironically, I think will be Liberal Party economic management credentials. We've already seen a huge black hole in their costings. We've seen a big debate emerging now within the coalition about the Automotive Industry Assistance Fund.
Sure, but we're talking about what Labor needs to do. What Labor needs to do here, and it might be well and good in campaigns to target the opposition, but it's all about governing while you're in government, isn't it? And this is what people are looking to Labor for.
Well, it's two things, David, frankly. It is that. It's making sure that the policies that the Prime Minister has put on the table are implemented and that there's some comfort around that, including the mining tax. But it's also about really starting to campaign against the opposition and making sure that Tony Abbott doesn't get away with some of the things that he's been getting away with in the last year or two. I think that is critical.
What about the leadership talk, though, in Labor? Julia Gillard has got to move on from this, or it's got to come to a head one way or another. What do you think is most likely to happen here when we look at the relationship between Julia Gillard and Kevin Rudd, the talk of him making a move sometime this year? What's your best guess?
Well, I think it's all going to depend on how the polling goes, frankly. We'll see a whole new round of polling probably in early February. And if the Prime Minister has got a boost, and she was starting to show some signs of getting some lift at the end of last year, if that's continuing, then I think she'll be in a more comfortable position. The big challenge will be to make sure that she does get a boost in the polls, because if she doesn't? Well, if we don't get it up to somewhere around the 40 mark, then I think people will start to get anxious. And at that point, then you do have to speculate about what could happen as far as leadership goes. But I think we're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit there. We should wait and see how the polling goes in the first few days of February, and that will, I think, will be an important time for the government, because people who have been back in their electorates over the Christmas, New Year period, they will be assessing perceptions in the electorate about the Prime Minister's performance, and they'll be making some judgments about that in coming weeks and months. But that's another reason why Julia Gillard has to really start taking it up to Tony Abbott in a very significant way. She has to be seen to be combative. She has to be seen to be a Prime Minister who can beat Tony Abbott and not just have a draw, which is essentially what we had last year in the election.
I guess the point is she doesn't have a whole lot of time. David, what about on the coalition side? Tony Abbott and the coalition comparatively had a pretty good year last year. Is there a need, though, now that we're into 2012, the second year of the term, to change tactics in any way, or do you think stick with the strategy?
The strategy has been spectacularly successful. Any time you have the Labor Party, as Bruce has referred to, down in the low 30s, the high 20s, I mean, you shouldn't be questioning your own sort of tactics or strategy. I mean, you've got the opposition right where you want them. I mean, Bruce sort of talking about sort of going back harder against Tony Abbott, but I think that's actually one of the things that got Gillard into the problem she was in to begin with, and it was the small rise she saw at the end of last year. I thought was due to her backing off that. If they want to sort of go back and make Tony Abbott the issue, he was doing quite well, thanks very much. And there's sort of this view
in that targeting of calling him Mr. No and all of that.
Yeah,
you don't think that works?
I think that's one of the reasons he's been successful. And Labor calling him to stop saying no sort of indicates that it was hurting. So with a litany of sort of bad policy decisions and things that have been viewed as sort of bungles with spending and so on and so forth, people want Tony Abbott to apply the rule. They want him to say no. They want a bit of scrutiny applied to it. So, I mean, if they want to go there, they can, I suppose.
And we're nearly out of time, but just finally, on the policy front, we talked about pokies, but what else? There's school funding will be, the whole public versus private issue. Bruce, what policy issues do you think are going to be the big battle fronts this year, or will the carbon tax still be it?
Carbon tax will be very much front and centre. We'll have to deal, of course, with asylum seekers, but school education funding, I think, is a good one for Labor. They've spent $65 billion almost in 4 years in government, which is twice what the Howard government did on school education. I think this is exactly the sort of area where Labor has to start focusing more and more traditional Labor areas. And if those policies start coming through strongly, then I think they can reassert their position with the electorate. And they should also be putting a bit of distance between themselves and the Greens party, making sure that people understand that when they elect a Labor government, they get Labor and not a Labor-Green coalition. All
right, and David, just finally and quickly, what policy fronts are you looking out for this year?
The only policy I think that's really going to be important in terms of a broader approach to policy is going to be what happens against the context of a global economy that is looking like it's in real trouble. Europe is really gone to the dogs. It's been downgraded. The US is looking shaky. We've seen some indicators out of Asia that it's not all well travelling in Asia, even though that's really been buoying our economy with exports. So I can understand.
It's the economy, stupid.
Absolutely, I can understand sort of why our Labor strategists would be talking about a core equity issue like school funding, but we got to be looking after the budget.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. David Gazhard and Bruce Hawker, thanks for joining us this afternoon.